Well, this is probably one of the most chilling and enduring myths of Irish folklore specifically. We're going to think tonight, like, who is she? What makes her scream, and how has she evolved through history? So the Banshee is very well known throughout the supernatural world, but there's a lot of mystery about her. Is she a fairy? Is she a ghost? Is she something else entirely? And what makes her wailing so haunting? Is it deadly?
Well, hey everybody, welcome back.
Hey everybody.
I'm Logan.
And I'm Nicole.
And we are Generation X Paranormal. So we have our resident historian.
Yes, she's back.
We have Rissa back. And we're going to be talking about something that I'm just not that familiar about. So what can you tell us what you know what we're going to talk about?
Well, I'm familiar with it, but I don't want to spoil her talk. So since we have a holiday coming up here in the States, we got St. Patrick's Day.
That's right.
So happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody.
That's right.
Wear your green.
Yep.
We're going to be talking about Banshees.
That's right.
And if you're not familiar with Banshees, you're about to learn all about them.
Yeah.
And it's something I've always loved growing up, because I love anything with the Celtic lore.
For
so
sure.
I do know a little bit about what she's going to speak about, but I'm sure she's going to school me on some things. So
she's going to school the heck out of me.
Yeah.
So let's get her on.
Let's talk about Banshees.
Well, hey Rissa, welcome back.
Well, thank you so much for having me back. I'm delighted to be here and to be talking about one of Nicole's favorite topics.
Yes, I'm so excited.
Yeah,
I can't wait.
She's been dancing across the halls today, knowing that she's going to get to talk about what we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes,
yeah, it's definitely something I got to admit I am not that knowledgeable of, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a little bit about folklore and stuff, but for some reason this particular subject, I guess, has escaped me. But yeah, we're going to talk about Banshees.
Yes, we are. I can't wait to hear more about them, because I know a little bit, but
yes,
probably not to the extent of what you've done your research on. So
yeah, it should be a fun show. It never fails. Every time you're on, we always do something that either hits at the right time or just kind of connects with a lot of people, because it's like, first of all, my mom was always asking me, when's the next time Rissa's going to be on?
I know. She loves Rissa.
I'm like,
she's so excited when you're on.
I feel like she's not going to watch unless Rissa's on or something.
Yeah, when's Rissa coming back?
Yeah,
that's what we hear.
all the time. So
yeah. Well, it's good to know I have a fan.
Oh,
yes,
you do.
Yes.
My mom loves you. But yeah.
This episode will be coming out right before St. Patrick's Day. So
that's right.
Perfect.
We kind of timed it for the perfect American holiday.
It's just serendipitous.
Yes, it could be.
So Rissa, tell us about the Banshee.
Well, this is probably one of the most chilling and enduring myths of Irish folklore specifically. We're going to think tonight, like, who is she? What makes her scream, and how has she evolved through history? So the Banshee is very well known throughout the supernatural world, but there's a lot of mystery about her. Is she a fairy? Is she a ghost? Is she something else entirely? And what makes her wailing so haunting? Is it deadly? So over the course of our time together, I want to talk about her origins, her variations, some famous sightings, and her ongoing significance. The Banshee. So the legend of the Banshee, should I just jump right in? The history?
Yeah, jump right in.
Go.
All right, let's go.
Jump right through there.
All right, so the legend of the Banshee can be traced back to the 8th century in Ireland. Banshee, I cannot speak Old Irish language. Let's just be clear about that right now.
Fair enough.
None of us can, so you're in good company.
So it looks like the Irish word was Beansi, but it's pronounced banshee, and it means woman of the fairy mound or fairy woman. So banshees are supernatural beings believed to be harbingers of death. Now, maybe they connect to certain bloodlines or certain if people who have Gaelic lineage. Some say they are very specific families, like they have to begin with the surnames Mac or O, like MacDonald or O'Brien. Other people say that they're completely unbiased with their warnings. Some people think a banshee in your family is an honor. Other people think it's a bad omen. So to immediately clear the air, banshees don't cause death. They are a warning of death in your family. And her wail, which is a lament / scream, is probably going to be near the home of someone who's about to lose a loved one. The sound is compared to the cry of a dying animal and wind howling through the trees. Apparently, it's like an unbearable noise that like rattles your soul.
That sounds like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, a scream in any direction is still going to get my attention, but you make it sound like that, it's probably going to, well, it's definitely going to get my attention.
Well, it's always the sound I imagine, like reading the book Wuthering Heights. You know, they talk about the wind on the moors. And I think that's kind of what they meant in that book.
Sure.
Is like that cry, that howling.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I know about one banshee, and I hate the fact that it's the only one that I typically know about is from the Marvel universe because there's an actual there's a banshee and she screams and I'm a nerd. I get it. I understand. But that is the one that I typically always kind of, I guess, relate to when it comes to banshees. But hers is more one of their superpowers, and she just kicks butt with it. But that's interesting.
Well, you played your man card for this episode, so
well,
let's get back to the other.
I kind of burnt it early, I guess.
Yeah, you did.
All right, fair enough.
So some people call this the Banshee's song, even though I can't find very many accounts where it sounds like she's singing and more like she's screaming. It generally is heard a day to a few days before the death of a family member or the person for whom it is intended. So this story, there's some wiggle room in the story.
Sure.
So I want to go back to the Irish tradition of keening, Keen. This kind of mirrors the role of a banshee. So this was when there were professional female mourners known as keeners who would wail and lament at funerals to express grief. And these women were usually paid in alcohol. And they would sing these sorrowful dirges. They would cry and tear at their hair, and they were an essential part of a traditional Irish funeral. Now, some people said that because they were paid in alcohol, that they were sinners and that they would become banshees eventually. But I mean, if that's what they've been doing their whole life, I guess just keep at it after death. I don't know.
Right.
Why not?
Professional at that point.
If the shoe fits. You know?
Yeah, I mean, if you got a good thing going, keep going.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about, before we got started, that's not too unsimilar to like native cultures. That there seems to be some correlation between the two.
The wailing.
And I don't think it was spawned by like alcohol, but it was. I can't remember how that kind of worked out, but yeah, I know about that particular practice, at least from like a native standpoint.
Right. Well, there were structured elements to keening. I mean, it wasn't just like a lot of screaming. There were verses, there were wailing cries, there were symbolic gestures of like beating your chest, pulling on your hair. And most keeners were actually women with really, really strong voices. And they could like create an effect where it was like everybody was moved to tears. But then the Catholic Church lands in Ireland. And they decide they really aren't wild about this. They begin to frown upon keening in the 18th as early as the 18th century, and they say it's just too pagan, and that the Irish have to cut it out. But the keening keeps going for a while. Families are used to it, like it's part of their system, that these keeners would be hired, they would stand guard over the body, sometimes for more than one day, and it didn't matter if the keeners had ever met the person or not. That was completely irrelevant. This was like their profession, right? Keening was pretty much over, though, by 1950. There were a lot of factors in this. The church was one of them. The fact that the keening was done by women was also not like smiled at by the church. And there started to be this feeling that keening was kind of like backwards or part of like old thinking culture. So, they were looking for something more modern, a more modern way of mourning their families as we get into the 20th century. But you can still find keening online. I found a lot of examples of it on YouTube if people are interested. And the keen itself had the salutation, which was the introduction, the dirge, which was a verse, and then the goal, which was a cry. So those were like the three main parts. Just like if you were writing any other kind of song or poem, it had particular parts.
Right.
So it is fascinating. And it is if you go and listen to it, it's something you'll remember. It is definitely a very haunting kind of song.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be.
Yeah.
You think about dirge in general, having somewhat of a musical background, those are typically very, very dark, very kind of an ominous sound when they're played. And I think dirges, for the most part, like the one I always think of is like for sailors. There's a really famous sailor's dirge that, when they think that they're going to pass away on the land or on the water, that's one of the songs that they play. And I think it's the one using Titanic, actually. I can't remember, the name escapes me. The Peril on the Sea one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very popular dirge. So it's interesting, part of that structure. So, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
So I did want to take a moment to also note that during this time, a lot of Irish funerals were held in people's homes, but even more were held at local pubs. It used to be a legal requirement in Ireland that bodies were taken for safekeeping to the nearest pub before funerals. And so this further made these ladies scandalous.
Right.
It was called the Coroner's Act of 1846, and it happened because of the Great Hunger. Something like 1 million people died from starvation and related diseases. And mortuaries, doctors' offices, they couldn't, this is going to sound terrible, they couldn't keep track of all the dead bodies. So they had to be stored somewhere to keep them from being consumed by wild animals. And so the pub became the place, and sometimes funerals were held at the pub, and that's where the keening would take place. So that law actually remained on the books in Ireland until 1962.
No kidding.
Wow.
Wow, that's insane. Well, that's cool, though. I mean...
Yeah, but wow, I would never have thought that late into history.
I mean, you imagine they'd have to advertise something like that, because if you're coming, if you're just wandering through and you happen upon a pub and you walk in and there's a casket or something there.
Well, no, you always hear about like the most haunted places.
Oh, yeah.
Other than the castles are always the pubs. Always so now pubs, that would make a lot of sense.
No that makes a lot of sense for sure.
Yeah. That's interesting.
But let's get back to the Banshees now.
Yeah.
So there's the theory that the Banshees are the spirits of keeners doomed to lament for eternity. But then there are other people who say that Banshees were once noble women who died tragically and became bound to their family lineage. And then there's also the belief that it is the spirit of someone who died violently or very young. Now, all of this might lead you to think that a Banshee is a ghost.
Yes.
But no. In no telling is a Banshee a ghost. It's interesting because I even went to in Salem, there's a monster museum and they have a whole exhibit of ghosts. And Banshees are lumped in with the ghosts. They are not in the separate category. They're lumped in with ghosts. And I think the sign just said Irish screaming ghost or something like that. But that's a pretty serious simplification of what a Banshee is. But a Banshee is considered fae or a fairy. Now, if you think about what a ghost is, it's kind of the spirit of a dead person. Banshees Banshees are not a dead person, according to Irish lore. Even though there's all these dead humans that can become a banshee, somehow they become part of the Fae world in their death. So this is not like a restless or lost soul. And this is not someone who interacts directly with the living in the way that a ghost does. Their only job, their only thing they do is to forewarn of impending death. They don't bring it. They're not inherently evil. They're just like the canary in the coal mine. That's it.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, like the Fae elemental type.
Yeah.
Right. Having never actually had human form, but yeah, that's and I've heard a lot of different versions of that with Fae, but
and that whole world in the Celtic tradition is very intricate.
Oh, for sure.
Like when you get into the fairy and the elemental, I mean, there's so many like branches that go off from that. So
it's absolutely fascinating, really.
Yes, it is. It really
and we do have a lot of Irish listeners, so I'm sure they could probably school us pretty good on that. But
it is very intricate.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So to be clear, banshees are heard more than they're seen, but they do make an appearance from time to time. And I couldn't find any one note about how they look. So I'm going to go through all of the notes I found about what they can look like, about how they can appear. So it is always a female in Irish lore, always a woman. Actually, in American, too. I'm going to come to American banshees at the end. She always is a female, usually wears a cloak over a dress, very old-fashioned, normally has long hair, and usually has either pink or red eyes from continuous weeping and crying.
Okay.
So the most famous look for a banshee is sort of an ethereal young woman with flowing hair. Now, it can be silver, blonde, or red. And often she is seen with a comb, like a very beautiful comb. And she's combing her long hair while she's making these mournful cries. This symbolizes impending death because it's kind of a representation of the hair tearing gesture in the mourning tradition.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And some people even say that you can hear her comb running through her hair. And like, I have really long hair, as you both know. It's up tonight. But when you run a comb through somebody with hair with long hair, there is a sound. And if there's any tearing in there, it's a really loud, weird, uncomfortable sound.
Yes, it is.
So
for both people,
a mild nails on the chalkboard.
That like ripping hair sound. And so as I was reading this and thinking about it, I was like, that can be a very troubling sound, especially if it was like magnified to some supernatural level. So I was like, I could see how that would be a uncomfortable thing to run across, you know?
Yeah, and when you hear that tearing, you're right. It's it's a very unnerving sound.
It is.
And since I don't have hair anymore, I once had hair, but never quite that long. But I know that when you do that, it probably creates a sound for the person getting their hair kind of pulled on too, because your skull kind of works as like a little magnifier, like a megaphone inside your head. So, that's crazy.
Yeah. Now, I did say that banshees are not malevolent, but there is one thing that will make them very angry, and that is if you take their comb. You must never steal or take the comb of a banshee. So if you are walking along the road and you find a spare comb, especially if it's very nice, don't pick it up. If a banshee has left her comb, she's probably coming back for it, and she knows where it is. If you are unlucky enough to steal a banshee's comb, expect her to show up at your house. She will bang on your doors, walls, and windows until you reach through the window to give it back to her.
Wow.
Yes. There is a specific system, by the way, the Irish have. You must use iron tongs. If you use just your hand, expect an injury.
Iron tongs.
Yeah, where do you find iron tongs?
I guess if you're a blacksmith, you keep them on hand.
Right? But I got one of those back in the garage, you know?
Yeah. So
it's interesting
iron is
metal.
Yeah, iron is an age-old thing that protects you from the Fae.
Right.
So that's why they're iron in this telling.
It is interesting, though. And the other thing that cracks me up a little bit is, like, who the heck picks up random frickin' combs from the ground?
Well, you never know.
Yeah, I'm sure somebody does it. Yeah, I
mean, it's a beautiful comb.
Like, what if it was a very beautiful, intricate? Yeah, there's some beautiful silver combs. My grandmother had a beautiful comb.
Mm-hmm. But from the ground?
Well, I don't think so. Victorian, the old Victorian combs and stuff they had, they were very detailed and beautiful.
This, of course, coming from a man who has no hair, so please continue.
So yes, well, that was the end of that description. Next, the size of a banshee will differ. Sometimes they're only like 1 or 2, 3 feet tall, like tiny. I'm exactly 5 feet tall, so I'm pretty petite, so I would be tall next to some of these itty bitty banshees. But others are huge, like unnaturally tall, like 7 or 8 feet.
Yeah.
I could not find any notes on why some banshees are small and why some banshees are enormous. But I mean, either way, their voices are big, so I guess that's what really counts.
Yeah. That's interesting. I never heard about the small ones. I always thought it was a taller.
I always pictured her being tall.
Yeah.
Yes.
I do too. I guess probably because it's a big booming voice, you kind of expect.
Well, all the portrayals of one and all the pictures and art that's done about banshees, they're always very tall, or they're floating or something. So you always assume they're
the very
bigger.
next one, I'm going to say. She's frequently dressed in either gray or white, and she glides. Like, she doesn't have feet, and she never touches the ground.
Okay. Yeah, that's the one I'm more familiar with, or at least what you see the most of.
Yep. So next, the washerwoman tradition of the banshee. This is more of a Scottish thing, but it did filter into Ireland and Wales and some other places. You see an ethereal woman washing clothing in a body of water, a stream, a river, a lake. The washerwoman was in charge of preparing the body for burial. So basically, she is getting things ready for the funeral by washing the clothing. And she'll be doing this while she's doing the wailing.
Okay.
So yes, we can also have the banshee, who is an old crone with rotten teeth, nasty fingernails, and ragged clothing. Kind of, in this description, I thought of like the traditional, like, you have the maiden, mother, and crone. I feel like there are the range of banshees that are maiden, mothers, and crones as well.
Right.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah, it's weird when for some reason in my mind, when you talk about something that small, and then to have that particular look, I think of like a golem type figure,
Could be.
It being short with kind of that look to it.
Well, they've got the fairies and they got the leprechauns, and so everything's kind of smaller.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So maybe that's where it kind of started and then grew over time.
Hey, whatever.
You never know.
I mean, you're 5 foot. Rissa's 5 foot. I get it.
I know. We're the same size.
You guys are the same size. So. I'm not much taller, so.
So the last 2 descriptions that I found were more rare, but they're definitely out there. So some legends describe her as a headless adult woman carrying a bowl of blood and who walks up to your door that way.
Ooh,
this sounds mortifying to me.
Yes.
Like, absolutely terrifying. I much prefer any of the other banshees I've just described to show up.
Carrying a bowl of blood.
No head. Not carrying in the head. That's the Doulahan's job, I guess.
Yeah, the Doulahan,
right. Yes, the adult headless woman carrying a bowl of blood. I'm like, where's the sound come from if she doesn't...
Right?
Exactly.
Oh, it probably comes from like the neck hole. Gross. Oh,
yeah.
Man,
let's not linger here too long. I did not look for art on that for you, just so you know.
Yeah, thank you for saving us from that.
But she can also take an animal form, which is either the crow or the cat. And both of those animals can already make a pretty loud sound.
Absolutely.
Yes,
but if a banshee takes the form of a crow or a cat, look for the creature to have red eyes, just like the regular banshee does, and to make an abnormally loud screeching sound.
Wow.
Well, I could see where the cat would be involved with that.
Well, yeah, and a crow's, I mean, when you hear that screech, when it...
The call.
I don't know what the call.
Yeah, the call.
That is, if you're close enough to that thing, that is blood-curdling. It is freaky.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard it up close.
I definitely have. And it's one of those, when you hear it, you're like, you'll never mistake it ever again. You know exactly.
You know exactly what it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely.
You do.
Yeah.
So the one other thing about a banshee's appearance is that in any form, if you are indeed looking at a banshee, she will disappear. They vanish into a cloud of like mist or smoke, and this action creates a sound, the disappearance, that sounds like a bird flapping its wings. So I thought that was a unique way to disappear and kind of dramatic and cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. I was just like, all right, I like that. That's very dramatic.
That's like I keep thinking of like Batman, you know, when he does and it's a
With
big
his
puff
cape.
of smoke. And
Yeah.
Okay, I'm a nerd. I know. I'm sorry.
That's two superheroes
That's two
now
now.
we've talked about.
I'm going to go back to my corner.
So banshees can come in good and bad flavor. Good banshees are the enchanting women that sing their sorrowful song, and they're concerned with their families. So in Irish culture, death is considered sort of like a passage to the next realm, not so much like a final end. And the banshee is kind of like a guide into that transition.
Okay.
But on the other side of the coin, we can have an angry and scary banshee that hated their family that they're with, and they can be very frightening apparitions. And they're kind of like celebrating the demise of someone they loathe.
Jeez.
Wow.
And the vengeful angry banshees is just kind of not someone I want to run across.
No kidding.
So there's a Gaelic word for the bad banshee, and I don't know how to say it. I'm going to spell it. Baobhansi. So it's like babosai. But somehow,
okay.
I don't know. I probably just hacked that. I do not speak Gaelic.
Neither do we. So yeah.
This dark banshee is considered a fae, and she can actually become something that's not the same as a banshee. She apparently uses her delicate hands and her sharp fingernails to put cuts into victims and then to drink their blood in a vampiric way.
Ooh.
Apparently hunters are especially vulnerable to this dark banshee because she can smell blood on their clothing. And she will kind of sing and lure him in to his demise.
Wow.
Surprise.
Not unlike a siren.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking, like the mermaids and
Well, I would imagine that if you're hearing something like that when you're a hunter, you know, you're probably curious as to what the heck's going on out there in the first place.
Well, it's interesting. There's so many versions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. But no one is actually sure where banshees get their knowledge of a person's death. So that was something I really wanted to know. Like, what brings them forward? Like, why do they show up? Like, how do they know it's time? But I couldn't find any answer to that.
I think it sort of adds to the mythos.
It does.
Thing,
yeah.
You know?
It does.
Yeah. Just kind of like the Grim Reaper. Same concept. Like they're just sent to bring them.
Yep.
Or cross them over or something.
Know, even if we agree that they're fae, you know, sometimes even like flesh and blood can smell decay and possible death, like dogs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dogs definitely.
Right. It almost makes you wonder if, you know, because they're fae, if they have that extra bit of sense that they can actually maybe either sniff it or see it, but then again, they weren't human forms. So that's interesting.
Maybe they just know. We don't know how it works.
No. Here I am trying to be technical about something.
I know. There's no way you can know.
It's difficult to apply logic sometimes. I like to do the same. That's why I ask these questions, like, how did they know? Like, you know, that's why I go out looking to answer certain questions when I do these talks for you. Like, I want to know the answers to this, this, and this. And sometimes that's just not a thing.
No.
Right.
But I
think that just adds to it.
Yeah. Banshees are solitary creatures. They tend to be linked to usually a family or an area, and they usually appear by themselves. There were a few stories of multiple banshees showing up before royalty died. So I thought that was interesting, like to give you like the heads up about the death of a king or a queen.
Oh, okay. A more important role.
Yes, somebody who was bigger deal than us little people.
You get more than one banshee.
Yeah.
Because you're important.
Yep. Yeah. But those stories were few and far between. Much more common was the single banshee. Now, where do they show up? Most often near the home of the person whose death she is foretelling. And they say that the sound might sound very close, or it sounds like it's echoing from incredibly far away.
Mm.
And I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah.
That is interesting.
Sometimes she will be at the closest body of water. Again, she could be seen washing clothes. This would include streams, rivers, lakes. I don't think like the family pool counts. I didn't see anything like that. But,
right, yeah.
Well, I was curious. I was like, how do these stories modernize? Because there are definitely folklore stories that can be modernized for pools and things like that. But
well, and I'm thinking, and I know we'll probably get to it later, so I don't want to step on it, but I'm thinking of a very popular American sighting of something that kind of comes similar to this. And I'm not going to get ahead of it, but when we get there, maybe we'll talk about it for a second.
Banshees can also be found wailing at the nearest crossroad. So crossroads go back deep into folklore. We have a different American folklore about crossroads too, but crossroads are generally thought of as spiritually significant because they're liminal space, the space between two things. Bridges are also considered liminal space. I don't know if you remember, we talked about that a little bit when we talked about the bride on the bridge.
Yes.
But how there's these like gaps that are kind of like in between.
Right.
Crossroads, bridges, the crossing of two rivers, they're all liminal spaces. And they're places where you do find fae. And so it makes sense that banshees would show up at the closest of these things to you. And her voice would echo to your home.
That's interesting. Between two worlds, between two planes of existence.
That's interesting. Well, and then that kind of lends more to that theory of being able to spot, if they know that somebody's going to, shed the mortal coil, as they say, if you're living in between two different dimensions, I would imagine you'd be able to see that a lot better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they also show up near fairy mounds, which are allegedly burial grounds for the fae. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's another place they can be. And that leads me into talking about them as fae. So the fae is pronounced in Gaelic. I looked this up. Hopefully it's right. Is-she. And that's Aossi. And this is the supernatural world, the parallel universe of the fae. Now, this encompasses a lot of creatures, not just banshees, and not even just fairies. So, as I'm sure you know. But in Irish folklore, the fae are both revered and feared. They can be extremely unpredictable. They can be tricksters. Some of them are definitely benevolent, and they are like protectors of nature or certain locations. But others are capricious, mischievous, downright malevolent, like dark fae.
Yes.
They are known to be hidden in parts of the landscape, forests, lakes, fairy mounds, of course, like we talked about. And that this is where, allegedly, the story of the Banshee lives. This is not a ghost story. This is a story about a mystical race who serves as a harbinger of death. And I think that is probably one of the biggest takeaways from this story, is that she's not a ghost.
Right. Yeah.
She's like a supernatural messenger, basically. There is a legend, like a regular story that goes around Ireland about a farmer working near a fairy mound who hears the cry of a banshee. And he finds her, and she's a tiny thing, and she's weeping and wringing her hands. And then later he goes home and finds out that someone in his town had just died. Not his family, but his town. And again, like, there's lots of different kinds of fae. You guys did the story already on the Dullahan, which falls into the fae category, like the puka falls into the fae category.
That's exactly the one I was thinking of.
Yep. I actually love the puka story. But Banshee is one in the pantheon of the fae world. So I'd like now to get into some of the historic and modern sightings of banshees in Ireland. There were so many stories about banshees, and a lot of them have to do with very specific families. And so the first one is the O'Brien Banshee. So this was a noble family, and their banshee appeared as a beautiful young woman who would cry outside of their home. Usually, she would start crying before the person even got sick. Like, she was super early. She was the early banshee.
Wow.
And like, it's like, oh shit, there she is again.
Yeah.
Who's going to get sick?
Who is it? Yeah. Which one is it?
Yeah.
I could just see that. I picture like Conan O'Brien sitting at a table going, well, shit.
Anyway. Poor Conan.
Yeah, poor Conan.
Right. So next we have the McCarthy Banshee, and she was one of the banshees that carried a comb, and she had a silver comb, one of those very fancy, ornate silver combs. And apparently she left it lay around like a lot. So they would know she was there and know not to touch it because she would show up at their door asking for it back. In one story, a curious family member goes to investigate the Banshee and finds her sitting in the reeds combing her hair. And apparently then she just sank and disappeared into the water, like mist into the water. I thought that was kind of a neat visual.
Yeah, it is.
Very much so.
I wonder if they ever find her hair strands. I keep thinking like brushing your hair.
Yeah. I know that I should leave
got
them everywhere.
Hair.
Yeah, I leave them all over.
Yeah.
I left mine everywhere too.
That'd be an interesting angle to look into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't see any notes like that, but that would be even interesting in storytelling.
Yeah, it would
Imagine trying to take that into a DNA test. Hey, can you run this for me real quick?
So the O'Neill Banshee would show up by the River Boyne in Ireland, and she was another hair comber. She would stand next to the river, combing her hair and crying. And whenever somebody approached her, she would disappear into a cloud of mist, and then a death would occur in the family within days. One of the most famous stories in Ireland is the Bunworth Banshee. This story is probably the one I found the most. So Charles Bunworth was a clergyman in the 1700s in Ireland, and his family and servants reported hearing an eerie wailing cry near their home. And then, as you might expect, Charles falls very ill. And despite everybody's efforts to save him, because he was like a beloved member of the community, he passes away, like basically fulfilling the warning of the Banshee. And then on the night of his passing, she returns and wails all night long. And he was a harp player. So in this telling, there's harp music accompanying her as he passes over. In 1995, some Irish folks placed a harp-shaped plaque outside of the Bunworth former home to sort of memorialize this story.
Oh, that's cool. Nice. I like that one.
Yeah.
Something nice.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, these stories aren't all horrible.
Yeah, I know.
Right.
It's like you throw something nice in and everybody's like, oh, that's a nice little breath of fresh air.
Yeah, I have to give you a break sometimes, right?
Yeah. She had to make up for the headless bucket of blood.
Oh, that's just
I'm sorry.
That's good stuff, though. Yeah.
I mean, if I don't find something on more than two sources, I don't share it. But that one was out there. That's definitely a thing that's out in the world.
Yeah.
There's always got to be a grotesque version of something, you know?
For sure.
Yeah. So the Keening woman of Kerry, Kerry, was a Irish rural village, and she was like the village banshee. And basically, when somebody died, she would start wailing and basically let the village know that somebody had passed.
That's kind of nice, like the town bell.
Yeah. So then there's the story of Terry Glass Castle on the River Shannon. It was once a fortress, like a stronghold, really, of a chieftain named O'Carroll. And he set out to, go do chieftain stuff. And that night, the castle's watchman heard this unearthly wailing from the water. And under the moonlight, everybody who looked out saw this spectral woman gliding over the lake, like doing her lament. Wow. It was the O'Carroll's Banshee, and she was letting them know there was about to be a tragedy. And the next morning, when O'Carroll was supposed to return home, instead they received his body. He was slain in a duel with a man named O'Brien, and his remains were brought back instead of him returning to his castle.
That's interesting.
It's not a way you want to come back home.
No. It's not the best way to go home.
No.
Mm-mm.
But, so King James allegedly heard a banshee before his own death.
Really?
There are records of several people saying that an Irish woman came and sang for him. Didn't wail, but an unknown Irish woman sang to King James I right before his death. and it turned out that she was a banshee.
Interesting.
I thought that was a fascinating story. I really wanted to find more about it, but I was grabbing for it, and I couldn't quite get it. So
I've never heard that.
Me either. That's cool.
I liked that story too.
Yeah.
And my final banshee story comes from a friend of mine named Casey, who actually went to Ireland recently and visited Dungar Castle. It was built in the 1500s, and her tour guide, who she described as a wonderful Irishman who could tell a story, was telling the story about a ghostly washerwoman who would wash bloody clothes in the stream a week before somebody died. Basically, they would see this woman appear in this spectral form, and she would be crying and screaming, and she would be washing somebody's specific clothes. And they were the clothes of the person who was going to die.
Jeez.
Wow. Wow.
That sucks.
Yeah,
I know.
You're like
if I recognize my clothes, I'd be like,
Dang
there's
it.
my Iron Maiden shirt.
You're like, well, I better take care of some things if I only have a day or two left to live here.
Right, no kidding.
That's wild.
It's hard to know if this is a blessing or a curse,
Exactly. I think it's both. Yeah, I agree, Logan. Yeah. I think it's both.
Yeah.
Certain situations, depending.
So
I've always loved it, though.
Yeah, there's similar beings in other cultures. Like you were talking about the native cultures. I found some others. So Scotland has a banshee, and she is more of the washerwoman. And Wales has one. I'm not even going to attempt to say the word in Welsh, but she is sort of a spectral hag with bat wings who announces death.
Bat wings?
Bat wings, yep. So in Norse mythology, there are the Norns. They foretell death and guide souls back to the other world. And then in Japanese culture, there's a yokai called I might say this wrong, Yonaki Baba. And she is a crying old woman who remains outside of the house weeping all night before someone dies. So this is definitely a thing we see all over the world, this phenomenon, this entity.
Yeah, I can't place why, but I kind of think I know that the Japanese one.
Yeah, it sounds familiar to me. Like the Baba part sounds familiar.
I feel like we watched something. Anyway, it sprung one of those little, things in my head called brain cells. And anyway.
Just scratching your brain.
Yeah, it's like...
So the Banshee immigrated to America. Surprising.
Of course they did.
Yeah.
Of course it did. Yes.
Yeah. With Irish immigration, especially during that period of time we talked about, the Great Hunger, Banshee lore traveled with people. Irish Americans brought their family Banshee stories with them, and possibly their family Banshees. I mean, there are fae stories that came with immigration too. There are so many that come to mind. So it makes perfect sense. It doesn't seem at all strange to me that the Banshee story came along. And that these Banshees, they pop up in lore all over America now as well. So there are cases in Boston, New Orleans, New York, and apparently Greenwich Village has a fairly famous Banshee, and I ordered a book with a story in it. I thought I ordered it well in advance, and I still don't have it. Every time I get a notice, they're like, your book will ship soon. I'm like, can you mail it? Like,
yeah, I know when they get those.
I was like, can you send my book? It's like from some random bookshop in New York. And I've like called, I'm like, I need you to send this book. I need this Banshee story. And they're like, oh yeah, the Greenwich Village Banshee. I'm like, can you read it to me? Like,
right.
Can you help me out here? Yeah. So I know there's a Greenwich Village Banshee story. I lived in Greenwich Village. I went to NYU. Like I didn't know the story when I was there. It's so frustrating that I can't tell you this story tonight, but I tried.
Yeah,
and I'm telling you it's there. So for those who are listening and they are still interested, if you're in New York, go get the local ghost story books from the 1980s. It's in there.
That's so cool. Man, I can't believe that a New York store is having a hard time shipping something. I mean, it's like back in the old days of like in the 80s where allow 6 to 8 weeks of shipping. Yeah, right.
Right? I remember those days. Well, sometimes when you're dealing with like a little bookseller, it's like one or two people and it's an obscure book that I dug around to find and, it'll probably arrive tomorrow.
Yeah, probably so. Yeah.
just after the nick of time.
Exactly.
That's okay. There's always next time.
Yeah.
You know.
So yes, there is a famous Greenwich Village Banshee, and I cannot tell her story because I don't know it. But there is another in North Carolina, which is another place that a lot of Irish folk settled. And this one goes back to 1781 along the Tar River in Edgecombe County. So this was around the time of the Revolution. I guess just after the time of the Revolution. And Dave Warner had a sawmill on the Tar River. And there were some British soldiers still hanging around there that allegedly chained him up, threw him into the river, and took his property. But they say that just before Warner died, he put a curse on the soldiers. And so his Banshee arrived to fulfill it. And they say that she came for the men who had hurt her person and led them one night into the river where they drowned.
Interesting.
Yeah.
A vengeful Banshee.
Well, she's part of the... Well, this goes back to the Banshee being part of a family.
Right. Yeah.
Warner doesn't sound like a super Irish name to me, but who knows where marriage came from there.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, that's pretty freaky.
That's pretty awesome.
Well, yeah. I mean, it is awesome,
Actually,
but...
a Banshee at your disposal to, like, sick out people
it's
who've done you wrong.
Speaking of Doulahan, it makes me think of, like, you know, Sleepy Hollow when she's got the head of the... Yeah. It's like, oh, yeah, go ahead, do my bidding, please.
Yeah, right.
That's exactly, it's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
That's an interesting story. I like that one.
Well, they say that Banshee still appears from time to time on the Tar River, and that you can hear her crying.
That would be weird to hear.
Yeah.
I would be terrified if I heard a Banshee cry.
It would be.
I'd be like,
scary.
uh-oh.
And we're kayakers, so I can imagine us being out on a kayak going, let's turn around. You know, there's something happening up there.
Like, I didn't hear anything, did you? No.
Yep. No.
I wonder if it's similar to like a mountain lion cry, because they say it sounds like a woman screaming.
That's true.
But this is more of a wail, so maybe it's like a version of that. But I mean, that's terrifying if you've ever heard it out.
I have not. Just a fox by itself can terrify me.
Oh, yeah, a fox is terrifying.
That is a strange sound.
I've heard it before when I was a child, and it was scary. I thought some woman was like getting hurt in the woods, and it was really scary.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine hearing that.
So I wonder if that part of that could come from that. I don't know.
Potentially, yeah.
Could be.
In North Carolina, anyway. I mean,
Oh, for sure. For sure. So the next one, we're going to go to South Dakota, surprisingly, which was not a place there were a lot of Irish immigrants. But this is a native story that is a Banshee. Okay. So allegedly, I couldn't nail down any history on this, but I did find this story in several books. There's a native woman who was killed by white men, which is very believable. And that she became a Banshee in the desert, and that a lot of the folks who use this desert, right? This is the Badlands of South Dakota. Yes. Mostly cowboys or people who are just passing through. They're not afraid of much that's going to be out there, but apparently this Banshee is terrifying. She only appears at night. She'll appear first on the hill called Watchdog, is it Butte? B-U-T-T-E?
Yeah. Butte,
Butte. And her dark hair will be blowing. So this is a change in the story. And then if you keep going and you don't turn back, apparently there are some rocks there that are sort of phosphorescent, and they start to flash. And the Banshee will sweep up and stand right beside you. If you speak to her, she will start screaming.
Ooh.
That's some nightmare fuel there.
And if you've ever been in the desert at night, I mean, it is dark.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize
and that wind blows. I mean, it can be pretty creepy.
Yeah.
That's a scary one.
Yeah, it does feel cool. It feels like unearthly in the desert at night.
Yes.
Yeah,
so like the idea is if you see her, you don't talk. Keep your mouth shut.
Yeah. That's
okay, I probably don't think I could talk either.
Primarily, I'd probably soil myself first, and then...
Unless it was... I'd probably too frozen in terror to make any kind of sound.
That's for sure.
Wow.
So she will eventually disappear. You might still see her wringing her hands and weeping on the hilltop. But they say that where she likes to hang out, cattle don't want to graze, and local cowboys don't go there because they know better. Now,
interesting.
One of the most peculiar things about this banshee is there's another haunting there. It's a creature that appears as a skeleton, and it will like walk through camps where cowboys are camped out. And if it hears any kinds of music, it'll sit down and start to hang out with you. If you leave a fiddle out, it will play it. But no matter what, you must never follow the player away from the campfire, because he will definitely lead you to your death.
Interesting.
Wow.
And apparently this haunt happens in the same place, the same mountain pass area as the Banshee.
That's odd.
Yeah.
So it's a skeleton?
That's what the story says. Appears as a skeleton.
And people are not... They're just like going to let a skeleton walk up and sit down at their campfire.
Here's a fiddle. Enjoy yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know
I'm
if you're
here
hungry,
for that.
but we got some beans.
What a story that would be.
Yeah, no kidding, right?
I mean, can you take a selfie with it?
I love to hear these stories, though. You just always wonder where they come from.
Yeah, like what is the origin of the fiddle playing skeleton that wants to follow it to certain death? I'm like, honestly, I'm not going to follow a skeleton away from the campfire anyway. That's probably not going to happen. You know?
No.
What makes me think is that guaranteed this has had something to do back in the old days with alcohol. I'm sure they were completely... they ripped out of their head.
The cowboys told, stories around the fire, so I'm sure it was some kind of...
Yep. And then one of the cowboys got ripped and then walked off and probably fell off of a cliff.
Yeah,
and they're like,
very easily up there.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
This could be like stay close to the camp, stay close to the fire kind of a story, like a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the Banshee in the past, though, I don't know what she doesn't feel like a cautionary tale. She feels a bit more vengeful than the other Banshees.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Well, there's so many, they always talk about, native curses on the land and stuff like that in the West from all the tragedy and the deaths. And especially in those canyons.
Oh, yeah.
There's always, stories about the canyons where the wind whips through. So that kind of matches up with that, I think.
There is definitely... I mean, I'm only half. And I can tell you that even being half, going through some of that desert, being raised pretty much in Arizona, there is so much lore and so much that is pulled from that area that there is so much cultural attachment to this type of thing.
Yeah.
So that doesn't surprise me, and especially
not in the least.
No, and given what's happened with the Native women and what's happened especially now historically. Over time, I sure hope there's a Banshee woman out there doing that, because there's some really not so good stuff happening there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I have one more American Banshee story. This one is going to bring us to West Virginia. And Thomas and Mary Marr were immigrants from Scotland. And Thomas kept noticing a woman riding a horse, and she was obscured by a cloak. And in February of 1878, the horse and rider approached the house where Mary was waiting for Thomas to come home. He had mentioned to her that he had seen this horse and rider, this woman riding. I mean, they lived kind of out in the middle of nowhere. So it's not like there would be a lot of ladies in cloaks riding around,
Yeah,
the rider came close, and she saw the face of a veiled, pale woman who said, "I am here to tell you, Mary Marr, that Thomas Marr has just died. Say your prayers, lady, and I bid you well." And disappeared. Years later, the Banshee made one more appearance when Mary died. And at her funeral, they say that there was the keening of an unseen woman from the hills.
Wow.
I like that one.
That's really cool.
Yeah. No wailing, but she actually talked to them.
Huh.
That's a new one.
Yeah, in West Virginia, that's another place that, if you've never been there, it's not like a bunch of big cities. There's so much rural openness out there that you get lost out there, and I would imagine a Banshee could come up to you out there, because it's and there is something with West Virginia, because I was in Franklin, West Virginia, and I got lost in the mountain
Was
range.
that where you got lost? In the Appalachians?
Yeah, in the Appalachians, trying to get back home. Yeah, it was not good.
In the middle of the night?
Yeah, in the middle of the night. And there is something about driving through that range that it gives you all the feels. I mean, it's something happening out there.
It is interesting country, and it definitely has a lot of its own sort of lore and, how do I want to say this? It has its own culture and lore. Mm-hmm. It's very different from other places.
Absolutely.
So that's my last stories. American Banshee story. And I thought I would be able to find tons of Banshees in popular culture. But as I said before we get started, there weren't that many. There are some. There are a few. And I just thought, honestly, this creature could use way more representation in modern storytelling.
For sure.
Agreed.
It's definitely a gap. I mean, what an interesting character, too. Now, they've had Banshees on some shows. Like, Charmed had a Banshee that didn't just announce death, but, like, sensed people's pain and then killed them over it. And, of course, Supernatural had an evil Banshee who forced people to shatter their skulls with her voice.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, that's not at all what a Banshee does.
Right.
And more in the classic literary, William Butler Yeats was an Irish poet and folklorist, and he was absolutely fascinated by fairy stories. He wrote a lot about banshees and other fae figures, and he was really fascinated with the idea of like the otherworldly realm. So you can find him writing about fae in his Fairy and Folktales of the Irish Peasantry collection.
You have to check that one out.
Yeah, that sounds like a good read.
Of course, everybody remembers in Harry Potter when the Banshee shows up, but it's actually not really a Banshee. It is a boggart. So
okay,
it was just somebody's fear of a Banshee that was represented by the boggart. In the I think they were in the dark arts classroom.
Yeah, I remember that. Yep.
Yeah, but very, very little. So, Logan, you had a famous Banshee you wanted to talk about.
Well, it was a native, and now I'm trying to remember. It was the one with the waterfall. Oh, gosh.
The one with the waterfall.
Yeah, there was a lady who was by a waterfall, yet again, water. And if I remember right, it had something to do with her father. Anyway, I don't want to get into it because I probably will completely butcher it, and I'll have to come back and update you later. But that was the one I was thinking of. But right now, my little sprockets aren't working.
So she was like wailing by the waterfall.
What had happened?
Well, there's lots of those stories though of like usually it's over like a failed romance or something like that.
Well, it wasn't a failed romance. I think it basically boils down to this, and I'm probably destroying it. But she was washing. I think she was bathing by the water, and there was obviously like an opposing nation that came upon her, and they slayed her, and then she ended up becoming a banshee. So anytime you would go to that body of water, you could hear the scream, and that typically meant that an impending death was coming.
Oh, okay.
Gotcha.
And I just, and the reason I butchering it is because I had it in my head and then it went, but yeah. That was the one that I was thinking of, and I'm sure our audience probably knows exactly the one I'm talking about and be like, yeah, idiot, it's this. But I don't remember.
Well, I don't know that story, but, I did want to draw a parallel between the Banshee story and the Lady in White story. So the Lady in White story is a classic ghost story. It's not a fae story. To be very clear, there is a difference. But the Lady in White often appears where there has been some injustice done to someone, usually a woman or a child. And she is also a very ethereal, pale woman. She's often seen at crossroads, at bridges, at bodies of water. You could also even equate this to La Llorona.
Yes.
Same vein of story. When I was doing all this Banshee research, I kept thinking of Lady in White stories. And I did think of La Llorona as well. Because I was like, they're adjacent. They're not the same.
Right.
But they're definitely adjacent. And a lot of the Lady in White stories will come up, not necessarily to announce a death, but to announce that somebody did die here and it was an unjust death. That like there was some tragedy that happened in a place, or that there was something horrible that happened to her, that she had to take her own life or take her children's life or something like that. But there was definitely some overlapping feeling between the story of the Banshee and the Lady in White. So I did want to mention that as well.
Yeah, and I know that there was some some talk about, obviously it's not necessarily a Banshee per se, but some people have even said like the Jersey Devil potentially could have been one, or even, I mean, honestly, even Mothman at some point. I know that some people had talked about that potentially being adjacent to the Banshee.
Right.
Yeah, I don't.
The Harbinger.
Right,
yeah,
the Harbinger.
Yeah. Yeah. I just feel like they're not close enough.
Okay, well, that's fine.
Like I try to keep them separated.
Well, the Mothman for sure, because there's so much.
Yeah.
But I can definitely see where there's some adjacency to it, because it is a harbinger of upcoming, danger or mortality or something like that.
Well, it is interesting, the Welsh one you mentioned with the bat wings.
Mm-hmm.
So that is interesting. It's the first time I've ever heard about the wings. Mm-hmm. And with Mothman having the wings, that is very...
Red eyes.
Yeah.
I mean...
Yeah.
It's
See, I'd never heard that stuff before, so that's... Yeah, a little bit more credence to it.
It's interesting. I mean, some people call Mothman Fae. Some people call it potentially being Banshee adjacent because of its ability to be a prognosticator of death.
Yeah.
How you like that? Prognosticator.
I'll give you a quarter for saying that word.
I appreciate it. I'll take it. I mean, I don't mind. Wow. So what a great... first of all, thank you again for all that research. I mean, that's just...
Well, I have one last thing to share.
Well,
yeah,
it's what to do if you hear a Banshee.
Oh.
Ooh.
Okay, yes,
yeah,
please.
This needs to be shared.
So, according to Irish folklore, if you hear a Banshee, take it seriously. This is a warning that someone in your family or your immediate circle is about to die. So the most appropriate action is to prepare yourself emotionally for news of a loss. There is nothing you can do to change an omen from a Banshee. You cannot fight it. You cannot bribe it. You cannot reason with it. It is a done deal. If you see or hear a Banshee, it is a premonition of death that cannot be altered. Now, if this happens to you, you should focus on preparing yourself and your family for the news of a loss. So reach out to your loved ones, check in on people's health and well-being, and when it happens, be ready to offer support. And that's pretty much all you can do if you hear a Banshee.
That's good advice, though.
That is good advice. Well, it's good advice in general, but especially if you hear that.
Right.
Yeah. And it's interesting because some people say crow. When you see crows
I see ravens
and
too.
ravens, that's also a harbinger. And it's interesting that the Banshee is somewhat adjacent to that as well. So it's interesting. I mean, there's definitely...
There's got to be something to it. All these legends and stuff always go back. They're all very similarly related in a certain way. So something has started that. But what?
Well, and I also think take the raven, for example. They can sense vibration. They can sense different, just different frequencies from what we have, just by the way they can fly and things like that. Right. So I would imagine that maybe one of the reasons they're capable of doing that is that they can sense that vibration and that frequency from a potential, problem.
Well, and if you think back in those time periods, like now when people die, usually it's in the hospital, or there's not a long prolonged death at home where they're suffering and basically their body's decaying.
Right.
Animals are going to smell that. I mean, there's probably, where a lot of this stuff has started or began.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It was only around the time of the Civil War when the funeral industry started up.
Right.
Because there were so many deaths and people didn't know what to do, unfortunately, with all the dead soldiers. That's kind of when the whole cemetery industry started and the funeral industry. But before that, it was very normal to die at home. It was a regular part of life that you would eventually die at home. They would have your wake there, and you would be buried in your family property or churchyard, one or the other.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because being paranormal investigators and doing the things that we do, we always know that everybody says, well, did somebody die in the home? Well, if it's an old enough home,
yes,
somebody died in the home.
It's more than likely, yeah.
Yes.
It's a given, and the chances of there being some sort of attachment, depending on how old it is, there's very good likelihood to it. So,
but it was normal.
Yeah. Well, okay.
That was great.
That was really good, even with the blood bowls.
You definitely taught me some things I had never heard before, and I've looked a lot into it over the years. So that's really great. Yeah.
You deliver and knock it out of the park. It's what you do.
I try. No, this was a fun one because I had to dig really hard for some of this. It wasn't like it just fell out, out of like 3 books. It was scattered everywhere because the legend of the Banshee has sort of fallen out of favor. I think it's kind of sad because I think it's actually a beautiful story.
Very much so.
What a gift to be warned that somebody's going to die. You'd have time to prepare. You'd have time to settle your accounts. You'd have time to say goodbye.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it'd be nice to know, but also I can see where it's
heart-wrenching.
Very troubling.
Exactly. Which is where the wail comes from. I think that's
very much so.
The grief.
It's the burden of knowing.
Yeah.
Well, our resident historian has knocked it out of the park once again. Rissa, I know you're probably crazy busy. I know you usually are.
Yeah.
But for our audience that wants to catch up with you, what you got going on?
Oh my gosh. Well, March, I'm turning 50. So that's big.
Congratulations.
For me. Yeah.
Welcome.
This will come out right around the time of my birthday in March. So that's a big thing for me. But I have all my usual stuff going on. I'll be talking cryptids and ghosts. I'll start ghost tours up again in April. And if anybody needs to find me or track me down, they can go to teandsmoke.com. I post my schedule on the blog there every month, so you can see what I'm doing in person and virtually as well. So if there's something that, also I wanted to throw this out there. If there's any historical thing that any of your listeners want to hear about, ask. I'd love to know.
Yeah, for sure.
I know we've got a cool one coming up in May.
Yes, we do.
We do. It's going to be so cool.
It is.
I'm excited.
I've already started working on that, so that's fun.
Cool's kind of an operative word there. That's kind of interesting.
Ice cold, perhaps?
Yes, ice cold.
Yeah, honestly, and the same goes for us. Everybody's got our email address or hit us up on social. Say, hey, love to see you guys and Rissa talk about this, or see if Rissa can kind of go down the matrix hole of X, whatever it is. By all means, let us know. As you can see, she brings it. So, I'm
a very tenacious researcher.
Yes.
And a very valuable one.
Yes.
We appreciate it.
I appreciate you all. I love being on your show. This is great.
Oh,
great.
Yeah. You're still one of the cast now.
You're
part of us.
You're part of the family.
One of us. But anyway, Rissa, thank you so much.
Yeah,
and we look forward to connecting with you again. Thanks, Rissa.
Thank you so much, Rissa. We love having you on.
She just knocks it out of the park, doesn't she?
Yeah, she does.
Yeah. Yes, Mom, I had her back on. I was telling Rissa that my mom's really enjoys having her on. In fact, she probably enjoys her more than me, but that's okay.
Yeah, probably.
Anyway, yeah, it was great.
There were some definite things I had never heard before.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that not just the folklore behind it, obviously it's really ingrained in culture. It's ingrained in, in belief structure and stuff. But, there's so many different parallels from other things that, like, they're adjacent, like we were talking about, where it lends not only credence to the Banshee lore, but it just makes a lot of sense for some things, too.
Yeah, and there's some, like we talked before, all the warnings about death.
Mm-hmm.
Here's two-sided to that, because while it could be a good thing, it could also be a bad thing. But I also think, you think about, and if you've ever, had someone that you pass away, after it's over, sometimes knowing about it, I think, is a little bit better, because you can prepare yourself. I think some of the worst grief I've ever had over someone passing away is when it's a shock.
Yeah.
It's a shock. There's no preparation for it, and it's just like, bam. And it's extremely hard to get over after that. So maybe that's where this comes from, because she said, this is what you're supposed to do if you hear the Banshee cry, right?
Like a protective kind of.
Yeah, like be prepared. Mm-hmm. This is coming. Get everything in order. Say that you love them, tell them their goodbyes. Because that's always what someone says is I didn't get a chance to say goodbye.
That's true.
I didn't get to, tell them how much I love them or so it's almost comes from a loving place, I think.
I think so. There's definitely some thought to that for sure. And you're right. Sometimes you think that there's going to be some ease when you know about it, but you and I both have been through a loss where we knew way ahead of time. Mm-hmm. Maybe not,
I've been through both.
Right. We've been through both. And
multiple times on both sides. And I don't want to know someone's going to pass away. I will say the recovery from it has been easier.
Sure.
Than sometimes the no recovery.
Yeah.
Of a sudden loss.
That's true.
So I think it's maybe just a cultural loving way of a family saying, hey, you need to prepare. This is about to happen. Now, while I say that, I do not want to hear the Banshee cry.
No.
Anytime soon.
No, I don't.
Especially if it were for your own death. That would be creepy. But I also think, like, if you're that close to death, most of the time you know about it.
Yep.
At least if it's in a biological way, not like something that is a tragedy. But, most people know that it's coming.
Yeah, they do.
So, I don't know.
Freaky.
It's a very interesting legend or lore. Maybe it's not lore. We don't know.
We don't know. I mean, ladies and gentlemen.
The Fae world is very vast.
Public service announcement. If you find a woman with no head at your door holding a bowl full of blood, you might have a problem.
Yeah, I don't like that version of it, though. No, that's pretty bad. It's too much like the Headless Horseman.
Well, yeah.
The Headless Horseman's kind of cool because he's got a horse, but...
He's a man with no head. Sorry.
Pulling out the Johnny Depp on us.
I did. Okay. All right, guys. Well, listen, we had a great time. Rissa, thank you for coming on. We had a blast, and she's going to be back on soon, guys. Don't worry.
Yeah, we've got another interesting one for you coming up in a few months. So,
all right, guys, take care, and we'll see you next week.
Happy St. Paddy's Day.
Happy St. Pat's.
Thanks for tuning in to Generation X Paranormal. Remember, all editing is done in-house and we're a self-funded podcast, so your support truly makes a difference. Like, subscribe, and follow us on all socials to stay connected. Special thanks to Eric Cooley for creating our music. And don't forget to check out our Patreon for exclusive content and ways to help us keep the show going. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the unexplained.